My name is Evelyn Prescott, and I am 35 years old. And just a few hours ago, I lost everything: my children, my home, and the life I had spent 10 years building. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the ink drying on the paper as the judge signed to erase my name from the right to be a mother. Daniel Slaver smiled, a rehearsed smile, cold and merciless, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if this was just another business deal successfully closed. I was wearing the navy blue dress Daniel once chose for me to look more sophisticated. Today, it had become the uniform of failure. When the gavel struck, it didn't just end a marriage, it erased the woman I once was. Before I tell you what happened after that day, tell me where you're watching this video from. And if you've ever had to stay silent while others decided the value of your life, hit like and subscribe. Because sometimes, justice begins with those who once lost everything, because what happened next, no one in that courtroom could have imagined. When the court clerk began packing up the files, I sat still like a statue, each paper neatly stacked, each pen capped all tidy, polite, and ruthless. I looked around and saw strangers whispering, some even smiling with pity. In that moment, I realized no one in this room truly cared about what had just been taken away. No one understood the silent sob caught in my chest when the judge said the word custody. Daniel turned his head and glanced at me, his eyes smooth and empty. No trace of the man who once called me his soulmate. He walked away, posture straight and confident, one hand resting lightly on his lawyer's shoulder. He swallowed hard, knowing that if a single tear fell, it would be the only evidence of my defeat. The only thing left between me and the world was silence. But outside, where the snow had just begun to fall, that silence was about to become the beginning of something else. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the cold wind slapped my face. The Aspen sky was thick and gray, the first snowflakes of the season drifting down slowly, as if even time itself pitied me. On the steps ahead, reporters crowded around Daniel Businessman Wynn's child custody case. They called him. Camera flashes flickered, reflecting off his polished leather shoes and triumphant smile. I lowered my head, pulled my coat tighter, and hurried past, hoping no one would recognize the trembling, defeated woman in the wind. Each flash of a camera sounded like a gunshot aimed straight at the part of my life I had just lost. But I didn't know the last photo they captured wouldn't be proof of my failure, but evidence of the day I began my return. The parking lot was covered in a thin sheet of snow, white enough to hurt my eyes. I saw Daniel's black SUV parked in the distance. Through the fogged window, my daughter Ellie, 8 years old, had her face pressed against the glass, tears streaking down the surface. Beside her, Tyler, 6 years old, sat still, staring straight ahead as if he still couldn't comprehend what had just happened. I wanted to run, to hold them, but the car door shut the moment I reached it. "Mommy loves you," I whispered, but the wind swallowed my words. The car moved away, leaving behind tire marks on the snow neat, cold, disappearing as quickly as my family. There are words a mother speaks that never reach her children. They dissolve into the wind, like the last breath of a former life. Yet within that loss, something else was quietly awakening, something Daniel would never see coming. I opened the door of my old Subaru. The cabin was freezing. My breath fogged the windshield in small clouds forming, fading, and forming again. My hands still trembled as I placed them on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, the courthouse grew smaller, and there, in the blur of falling snow, I saw myself not a wife, not a mother, but an empty outline in human shape. 10 years. For 10 years I had given that man everything. I had my youth, my faith, and my dreams. While he built his empire, I was the one managing his meetings, brewing coffee for clients, and cleaning up after parties once they were gone. I once thought I was part of that success. Turns out, I was only the backdrop. Outside, the snow kept falling. I started the engine. Its hoarse rumble echoed in the wind. I didn't know where I was going, only that there was one place left that still had my name on it, the old wooden cabin on the mountain slope, where my mother once said, "When you've lost everything, go back there. Sometimes, the place you fear returning to the most is the only one that still remembers who you are." I didn't know then that very moment. Between snow and silence, my life was beginning again. One more time. The mountain road twisted endlessly, long and quiet, as if it didn't want to take me back there. On both sides, pine forests were blanketed in snow, the dark branches bent low, whispering something to the wind. When the tires touched the familiar gravel path, the wooden sign appeared, Prescott Cabin. It paint peeling, tilting after too many winters. The 2-story wooden house stood in the clearing, its brown roof faded, the chimney still carrying the faint scent of old firewood. I stopped the car and sat still for a few seconds. My hand remained on the steering wheel, so cold it felt as if the blood had stopped flowing. The door opened with a rusty key. A gust of dusty wind swept through. The smell of decaying wood, of old books, and the faint trace of lavender my mother's scent mingled together. I flipped the switch. The weak yellow light flickered, just bright enough to reveal white sheets covering the furniture. Like silent ghosts, sitting in a forgotten room, I stood in the old kitchen, hearing the wind whistling through the window cracks, then hearing my own breath. For the first time, silence wasn't peaceful. It was a vast emptiness. There's nothing more terrifying than returning to a place that was once warm, only to realize it no longer remembers you belonged there. I lifted each dust-covered sheet. Dust floated in the pale light. On the small wooden table sat the chrysanthemum teapot my mother used to love. The water inside had long dried up, yet the scent of flowers lingered, faint as a weary greeting. I looked around. Everything was too tidy, too perfectly in place. The spice rack was labeled. Each drawer held a new bag of salt, and the tablecloth was folded neatly along the edge. My mother had been gone for 3 years, yet the house looked as if she had just stepped out this morning. On the fireplace mantel, the pendulum clock still hung there, its hands frozen at 11:47, the exact moment my mother took her last breath at the hospital. I don't believe in omens, but a chill ran down my spine, like an invisible thread connecting 2 worlds. I walked to the dining table. In the center lay a sealed envelope, neatly addressed in delicate handwriting, "Evelyn, for when you come back." My hand trembled. I didn't dare touch it, because if I opened it, I might lose the last thing still tying me to my mother. Some letters aren't meant to be read right away, but to remind you there are truths you're not yet ready to face. That afternoon, I heard a soft knock on the window. An elderly woman, slender, wrapped in a gray wool coat, stood on the porch. "Jeanette Moore," she introduced herself, voice trembling in the cold. "I used to be your mother's friend." We sat at the kitchen table, the teapot quietly steaming. "Mrs." Jeanette looked around, her eyes pausing on each detail, as if confirming something she already suspected. "Your mother always prepared for the future," she said, even when no one believed it was necessary. "The future," I echoed, a bit skeptical. She smiled, her expression tinged with sadness. "Before she passed," she said, "when Evelyn returns, she'll need to know who she truly is." I asked what she meant, but she only shook her head. The wind howled through the cracks, and the wooden floor creaked faintly beneath us. I tightened my grip on the teacup. "Do you know if my mother left anything behind? I'm not sure," she said slowly, "only that she locked something away, somewhere in this house." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if afraid someone might overhear. Then she stood and gently placed her hand on mine. "Don't stay too long in silence here, Evelyn. Silence in this house isn't like anywhere else." She left, leaving behind the scent of cinnamon and a sudden chill in the air. I spread an old blanket on the sofa and plugged in the heater. Outside, snow fell thick and heavy. The wind through the forest sounded like someone moaning in the dark. The lights flickered a few times and went out. Power failure. I reached for a candle on the kitchen shelf and struck a match. The small flame cast trembling shadows over the hanging white sheets, making them seem alive, breathing. I sat down, trying to write a few lines in my notebook, an old habit whenever my mind got tangled. But the moment the pen touched paper, I heard a faint metallic sound, like something gently tapping from within the wall near the porch. I held my breath. The sound repeated clink, clink, steady and dry. I grabbed a flashlight and walked slowly toward it. The wind slipped through the cracks, rustling the curtain, behind one wooden panel by the porch. A patch of wood was a different shade, as if it had once been replaced. I placed my hand on it ice cold. A glint of light flickered from a narrow gap, something metallic. I stepped back. The whole room seemed too quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath with me. That night, I couldn't sleep, because in the darkness, I knew something of my mother's was still here, waiting for me to uncover it. Last night, the sound of metal kept echoing in my head. I woke early. The first light of day slipped through the curtains, thin as a silver thread. The house was so quiet I could hear the wood creak beneath my steps. I walked to the back porch, to the section of wall that was a different color from yesterday. The wood was cold and dry, the scent of pine resin still lingering in its grain. I took a hammer and a nail puller from the drawer and tapped lightly. The sound echoed hollow, as if something was hidden inside. My heart pounded, each beat audible in my chest. I pried along the edge. Dust fell down. And then a metal object appeared. A small iron box, smaller than an oven, coated in gray dust and spider webs. I lifted it out, my hands trembling so much, I had to set it on the floor. The lock was rusty, but the engraved initials on the lid froze me where I knelt 3 letters. M.P. Margaret Prescott. I sank to my knees. Cold, dirty hands, a heart heavy as lead. A key I didn't have one, but the lock was strangely loose, as if someone had already opened it before. A gentle twist. Click. The lid sprang open. There are doors that only open when a person has suffered long enough to no longer fear what lies behind them. Inside was not money or jewelry, only a pale yellow envelope, with a familiar handwriting on the front. For Evelyn, when you need a reason to rise again. I sat on the floor, sunlight streaming through the forest window, slanting across the letter. I took a deep breath and opened it. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, you've probably lost something important. It might be a person, a home, or perhaps your faith in yourself. But don't be afraid. I was once there too, and I learned that sometimes losing everything is the only way to truly see what's still in your hands. My mother's handwriting leaned slightly to the right, steady and graceful. It felt as if her voice was whispering right beside me. If Daniel has taken everything from you, then take it back in the one way he can't stop you with your mind and your resolve. I've left you a few things, not just to survive, but to start again. Inside this box, you'll find your path. I folded the letter, inhaling deeply. The room was silent, yet I could feel her presence in the dust, in the light, in my very breath. Sometimes people don't leave us money. They leave us the belief that we can still return. Beneath the letter was a bundle of papers tied with a thin rope. I untied it, revealing stacks of share certificates, lists of bank accounts, and several unopened envelopes. Numbers, company names, signed dates, all written by my mother's hand. Neat and deliberate. I turned each page, my eyes wide in disbelief. My mother, a retired elementary school teacher, owned shares in 3 major investment companies in Denver. There were even hand-drawn financial diagrams, annotated in blue ink, in case you ever need freedom. I laughed as tears rolled down my face. I laughed because I realized that while I was trying so hard to be the perfect wife, my mother had been quietly building me an escape route. Maybe she had known all along that Daniel wasn't a man to trust. She hadn't intervened, but she'd left behind a map to freedom. Hidden behind wooden walls. I looked around. Everything in the house seemed brighter. Sunlight streamed through the window, landing directly on the iron box, making it glimmer like something alive. I whispered, "Mom, you knew all along, didn't you?" The next morning, I woke early. Snow still fell lightly, the sun slowly casting a pink glow over the pines. On the kitchen table, the iron box lay open, the letter resting gently in my hands. At the very bottom was a small key, tied to a note that read, "Highlands Bank, Locker, 247. I knew what I had to do. I packed neatly, slipped the letter into my coat pocket, and turned off the heater. As I stepped onto the porch, the snow crunched beneath my boots. Each step sounded like time cracking open. I turned back to look at the house, the place that held my past, my pain. And now, the secret of hope. There are journeys that don't begin with a decision but with a message from the departed, reminding you that you still have worth. I got into the car and started the engine. On the passenger seat, the iron box rattled softly with the rhythm of the road. The road back to town was veiled in mist. And for the first time in many months, I felt warmth rising inside me. I didn't know what I was about to walk into, but deep down, I understood. The battle to reclaim my life had just begun. I arrived in the town of Highlands when the snow had melted into gray streaks of water along the road. The bank stood in the center of the main square, a 2-story red brick building with a brass sign faintly gleaming Highlands Community Bank. I stopped in front of the glass doors, seeing my reflection in the cold surface, messy hair, a thick winter coat, and my hand still clutching the envelope with my mother's letter. Inside me was a tangled feeling of fear and hope. When I stepped in, the chill of the air conditioning mixed with the scent of new paper. A young clerk looked up and gave me a polite smile. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "I need to speak with the manager. I have a key for a safe deposit box." The clerk glanced at the key in my hand. Her expression shifted slightly. She left the counter, whispered something to a colleague, then disappeared behind the glass door. A few minutes later, a man in his 60s with silver hair emerged, gray suit. Slow but steady steps. "Are you Evelyn Prescott?" he asked, his voice calm but cautious. "Yes. I'm here for box 247. It belonged to my mother, Margaret Prescott." He paused for a moment, as if weighing something, then invited me into a private room. The sound of my heels echoed evenly on the tile floor, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. Steady but far from calm. Sometimes, the road to truth isn't opened by courage, but by the key of memory. The vault room lay deep in the basement, where the white neon light made the air cold and still, like inside a museum. "Mr. Warren," the bank manager, turned on his computer, entered a code, and then spoke softly. "Mrs. Margaret Prescott was a longtime client of ours. Box 247 hasn't been opened since her passing. Do you have her letter of authorization?" I opened the envelope and handed him my mother's letter. He read aloud quietly. "If the person carrying this letter is my daughter, trust that she is ready." He looked up, his gaze softening. "She always spoke of you, said you were brilliant, but too trusting." I gave a faint smile. My mother was right. He gestured for me to follow, then inserted the key into the lock. Box number 247 sat on the bottom row, smaller than I expected. He turned the key twice. Click. A sharp mechanical sound echoed through the room. The door opened. Light reflected off a thin layer of dust, revealing a stack of ivory-colored papers and a white envelope sealed with red wax. Across the front, a single line read, "Prescott Trust Confidential." I took a deep breath. My hands no longer trembled. They were simply cold. I opened the envelope. The smell of old paper mixed with metal made my heart tighten. Inside were copies of stock certificates, investment portfolios, and a bundle of handwritten notes. Each page was signed by my mother, M. Prescott, Highland Portfolio, 2012 to 2018. But what made me stop was the photograph tucked between the pages. My young mother stood beside a man in a suit, their hands clasping a folder. And behind them was a sign that read, Avery Capital Group. The name made me shiver. I had heard Daniel mention it. Avery Capital was one of his company's major investment partners. I looked closer at the man's face, sharp features, calm eyes, the kind of man who made decisions others only dreamed of influencing. On the back of the photo, in my mother's fountain pen handwriting, were the words Thomas Avery, the man my daughter can trust if everything falls apart. I froze. My mother hadn't just invested. She had built an entire anonymous fund under the name Prescott Trust managed by this man. A quiet, méticuleux plan, prepared in case I lost everything. I gripped the photograph. Dust and wax stuck to my fingers, the heat rising up my wrist. For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. Perhaps real strength isn't given, it's prepared in silence, waiting for the day we've heard enough to finally see it. When I stepped out of the bank, the cold wind struck my face, but this time, I didn't flinch. The file pressed against my chest felt heavy, but no longer as a burden, it was proof of faith. On the steps behind me, Mr. Warren called out, Miss Evelyn, your mother once told me, my daughter will understand one day that nothing is ever truly lost. It's only being kept somewhere safe. Now I think you do understand. I smiled and nodded in gratitude. As I opened the car door, sunlight reflected off the silver logo embossed on the folder, Prescott Trust. I ran my hand over it. The metal was cold but proud. In the rearview mirror, the woman staring back at me was no longer the Evelyn from 3 months ago, but someone who finally knew where she was heading. I started the engine. The sound was smooth, like breathing. Outside, the sky was crystal clear. Sunlight spilling over the red brick rooftops, a sign of a new beginning. I didn't know then that the man in that photograph, Thomas Avery, was about to enter my life in a way no one could have ever imagined. If you're still listening to this story, I leave the number 1 in the comments so I can send you my sincerest thanks. Because your presence truly matters. Morning light in Denver had that cold gleam reflected from glass towers like thousands of silver blades cutting through the air. I stood before the headquarters of Avery Capital Group, a tall blue glass building with a silver logo of a bird in flight. The man my mother had trusted for years, Thomas Avery, was on the 23rd floor. Inside, the atmosphere was nothing like the small banks I'd known. There was no laughter, no music, only the echo of footsteps on marble floors and the thick scent of black coffee filling the hallway. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. Mr. Avery is expecting you. The door opened. Thomas Avery stood by the window, his back to me. The light reflected off the surrounding glass, making him look like a sculpture carved from metal. Miss Evelyn Prescott, he said without turning around. I knew this day would come. I froze. You knew my mother. He turned. His gray eyes were calm and discerning. Not just knew her. She was the finest partner I ever had. I gripped the folder tighter, I feeling as though I was standing at the door to a world my mother had never let me see. Sometimes, the one who protects you is also the one who forged the blade you'll one day need to fight with. Thomas gestured for me to sit. The room was spacious, paneled in polished wood that shimmered in the noon light. On the desk sat a steaming cup of coffee and a thick stack of documents. I believe Mrs. Margaret left you the key to box 247, he asked. Yes. I nodded. I opened it, and I saw everything, including your photograph. He smiled faintly. She said you would come when you were ready. Then he opened the file on the desk. Evelyn, your mother wasn't just an investor. She was the founder of the Prescott Trust, the fund I co-manage. I I stared at the charts, the shares, and the numbers. He continued. A significant portion of that fund was invested in Hartwell & Co. Daniel Hartwell's company. My heart stopped. What did you just say? Precisely 22% of the shares under the legal entity Prescott Trust. No one. Not even Daniel. It knows who's behind it. I exhaled sharply, my mind spinning. My mother, the woman Daniel once dismissed as someone who just planted flowers and drank tea, was actually the largest anonymous shareholder in his company. Thomas closed the file and looked at me steadily. Do you understand what I'm saying? Evelyn, Mrs. Margaret left you something far more powerful than revenge. She left you control. There are battles that require no weapons, only a piece of paper and a signature at the right moment. I sat in silence. Outside, light poured through the windows, casting our overlapping shadows across the floor. What will Daniel do when he finds out? I asked quietly. Thomas poured another cup of coffee and placed it before me. He'll probably think it's a joke, until he sees the name Prescott Trust appear in the shareholder meeting. I smiled faintly, not out of amusement, but realization. What do you think I should do? You have two choices, he said, sliding a document toward me. Stay silent, and let the trust continue under its anonymous registration. Or sign this, Evelyn Prescott, and become its legal representative. But if you choose the second, he paused, his tone deepening, you'll be declaring war. Every eye, every rival, will turn toward you. I looked at the document. The bold title read, Transfer of Authority Prescott Trust. A blank line waited for a signature. In 10 years, I had signed many things, school applications, bills, and a divorce decree, but never anything that made my hand tremble like this. Thomas stood, walking behind me. Mrs. Margaret once told me, my daughter doesn't need saving, she only needs a chance to choose. Today, that choice is before you. I picked up the pen. The tip touched the paper, the blue ink spread in a clean, decisive line. Evelyn Prescott. I set the pen down. My heartbeat was steady now. Thomas glanced at the signature and nodded. From this moment on, you are no longer an outsider. He handed me a copy. On the page, the silver Prescott Trust. The logo shimmered under the light. A strange feeling swept through me, not pride, but clarity. When I stepped out of the building, the wind caught my hair. Denver glowed under the sun. Glass towers reflected the sky like mirrors of fire. I knew, somewhere in this same city, Daniel Hartwell sat in his office, certain he still controlled everything. He didn't yet know that a new shareholder had just entered the board, and that name was mine. And just a few hours later, when Daniel received the email announcing a new shareholder under the name Prescott Trust, the chair beneath him began to shake. Morning light streamed through the massive glass facade of Hartwell Tower. Cutting across the long, walnut-finished conference table, Daniel stood at the head of the table, jaw clenched, his fingers tapping rapidly against the polished surface. On the large screen behind him, the words shone in stark clarity. New majority stakeholder Prescott Trust, 22.1%. No one in the room dared to breathe too loudly. A trembling finance director finally spoke, Sir. The records show that Prescott Trust is registered in Colorado, but there's no trace of any individual identity behind it. The file is completely sealed. Daniele spun around, his gaze like a blade. Nothing is completely sealed. I want to know who they are now. No one answered. Only the soft hum of the air conditioning filled the silence. The light glinting off a half-full glass of water, shimmering like fragile crystal about to crack. When a man who once controlled everything hears the words unknown identity, it's not just fear, it's the beginning of collapse. 3 days later, an email was sent to the entire board of Hartwell & Co. The subject line was short and sharp. Request for financial transparency, Prescott Trust. Each line of the message cut like a cold blade. Evelyn sat in the small office of Prescott House, her hand resting lightly on a cup of Earl Grey tea. Eyes fixed on her laptop screen. On the display, Thomas Avery appeared in a video call. "Evelyn," he said. "They're losing control. Daniel will react, but we don't have to. Let him expose his own panic." Evelyn smiled faintly. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to seek revenge with words. All it took was one notification, and his entire empire began to tremble. She opened her mother's notebook and wrote a single line: "Silence is the highest form of power." The window was slightly open, the breeze carrying a faint trace of lavender through the bright white room. Outside, sunlight glinted off the freshly installed Prescott Trust sign, the silver letters gleaming like a knife under noonlight. Not the one who shouts the loudest wins. Sometimes, the one who stays silent is the one rewriting the rules. Daniel hired 3 separate teams: a group of lawyers, a private investigation firm, and an independent financial analyst. Each one returned with the same answer: unable to trace the individual behind Prescott Trust. He began staying up until 3 in the morning, sitting alone in his office, the yellow desk lamp casting a weary glow across his face, thinner now. Pale. The old wedding photo of him and Evelyn still lay in a drawer, its colors faded with time. One night, he took it out, staring at her smile, and for the first time in years, Daniel finally saw something in Evelyn's eyes he had never understood before: silent resolve. The next morning, Hartwell & Co. Stock slipped slightly. Financial papers began asking questions: who is Prescott Trust? A new investor quietly seizing control of Hartwell & Co. Daniel slammed the newspaper onto the table. "I want to meet the representative of Prescott Trust." He barked at his assistant. "Now, if they want to play this game, I'll play it to the end." Friday afternoon, the main conference room at Hartwell Tower. The air was thick, heavy as lead. Outside the windows, Denver skies turned gray, with thunder rolling in the distance. Daniel sat at the head of the table, a half-empty glass of water before him. The remaining shareholders were silent, waiting for the representative of Prescott Trust. The glass door opened. Heels clicked against the marble slow. Steady. Deliberate. Daniel lifted his head, and in the reflected light of the doorway, Evelyn Prescott walked in, her hair neatly pinned, an ivory blazer, eyes sharp and calm as glass. Behind her, Thomas Avery followed, carrying a silver folder. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel stood abruptly, his voice hoarse. "Evelyn, what are you doing here?" She stopped at the head of the table, set the folder down, and said evenly, "Good afternoon, Mr. Hartwell. I believe you've received enough notifications. I'm here as the legal representative of Prescott Trust." Every gaze in the room turned toward her. Daniel froze. A second later, the wall clock ticked cold and final. In that moment, Daniel understood the woman he once dismissed as a shadow. Behind him was now the light shining directly on his weakest spot. The 30th floor conference room of Hartwell Tower was flooded with silvery gray afternoon light. The giant glass wall reflected 2 silhouettes: Daniel, standing tense, and Evelyn, seated calm and composed. On the table, condensation beaded on Daniel's glass of water. He inhaled sharply, his voice tight and strained. "Evelyn, this doesn't have to go this far. I know I was wrong. But if you destroy Hartwell Co., you're burying your mother's name, the Prescott name, with it." She didn't answer. Her hand turned the silver pen slowly, its reflection glinting across the polished wood. "You really think this is about you?" Her voice was low, even, and steady. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you want, money power? Or do you just want to see me on my knees?" Evelyn smiled, not bitterly, but softly, like a farewell. "No. Daniel, I just want you to look at yourself. When a man who once held all the power finally realizes this battle was never about the company but about his soul." Daniel sank back into his chair and exhaled. trying to regain his composure. "You know I never hated you," he said. "We just chose different paths." He paused, as if rehearsing his old role, the calm, logical man, always in control. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes no longer filled with resentment, but with a painful kind of understanding. "Daniel, you never chose a path. You only ever chose yourself. When I asked, 'Can we work together?' you said, 'People don't invest with emotions.' But you invested everything into your pride." He stood, his voice rising. "Because I built this company with my own 2 hands. Do you have any idea how many years I—" She cut him off, her gaze unwavering. "I know. 10 years. 10 years setting tables for the partners you wanted to impress. 10 years turning down opportunities because you said, 'The family needs you.' And 10 years believing that silence was the purest form of love." Her voice trembled, but not with weakness. "Now I understand silence is never love. Daniel, it's the way people erase themselves." The room fell silent. Light from the window caught in his eyes, and for a fleeting second, Daniel looked empty, like a man who no longer knew what to say. He lowered his voice. "Evelyn, I'll admit, I was afraid of losing you, but you don't understand what it's like to carry an entire empire on your shoulders." She stepped closer, just 1 arm's length between them. "You were afraid of losing me. But you chose the one way guaranteed to make me disappear." Daniel's hand clenched slightly, while Evelyn stood tall, as if every year she'd spent bowing her head had vanished in that single moment. Outside, strong winds struck the glass walls, the faint vibration sounding like a heartbeat pounding against its own fear. Evelyn gathered the documents, her voice soft as the wind. "I didn't come here for revenge. Daniel, revenge only prolongs hatred. I came here to end it." Daniel lifted his gaze. Afternoon light fell across his face, revealing every exhausted line. "Did you ever really love me?" he asked. Evelyn paused for a second before replying quietly. "I loved the man. I thought you were the one who listened, who dreamed with me, but that man died the moment you started treating me like unpaid staff." She placed the transfer of management papers on the table, her tone steady. "Prescott Trust will run Hartwell & Co. as a legacy not yours, but of decency. You can stay if you learn to respect people more than you worship your own ego." Daniel gave a dry, brittle laugh. "I once thought you were too gentle to survive in this world. Now I see I was just standing on the wrong side." Evelyn nodded slightly, her eyes unwavering. "This world doesn't destroy the gentle. It only tests whether they have enough patience to become strong in silence. Sometimes forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the final strike that makes the other person collapse on their own." Evelyn closed her folder, buttoned her blazer, and rose slowly. Daniel remained seated, his trembling hand resting on the glass, the water inside long since gone cold. As she walked past him, she stopped for a brief second. "You once taught me that in business, there's no room for emotion. Thank you. Now I truly understand that, and because of it, I can finally leave everything behind." She turned and walked toward the door. "Evelyn," Daniel called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I apologize, is it too late?" She paused. In the whisper of wind and the golden light filtering through the glass, her voice rang clear. "Too late. No, just no longer necessary." She pushed the door open. The last light of the day poured in warm and pure. The door closed behind her, the click of the hinge sounding like a final period. Daniel sat there, staring at the paper on the table, then pulled out his wallet and took out their wedding photo. A drop of water fell onto the corner of the frame. Outside, the city was still blazing with light, but inside that room, an empire had just fallen, and a man had finally woken up. Evelyn didn't look back, but as she stepped into the hallway, she knew. Sometimes true victory is walking away with no hatred left in your heart. 3 weeks after the meeting, Daniel Hartwell's old office stood empty. The steel nameplate engraved with the word CEO had been removed, leaving 2 round holes in the wooden door. He sat in the dark, inside the same room that once echoed every morning with the footsteps of employees and the smell of strong coffee. Now there was only the sound of rain tapping against the glass. He opened his laptop, the inbox flooded with hundreds of messages, reports, liquidation requests, and press statements. In the corner of the screen, the latest message glowed quietly. Subject: Prescott Trust appoints new board chair. Daniel let out a faint laugh, the kind that sounds more like an empty breath. Once, he believed power could make people stay. Today, he realized power only keeps loneliness close. He stood and looked out the window. Denver, under its early June rain, shimmered in blurred lights behind the glass. And in that moment, he saw his reflection older, smaller, and utterly alone. When the applause fades to silence, that's when a man finally realizes he never truly had anyone standing beside him. The next morning, somewhere else, Evelyn drove toward Prescott Valley. Along a narrow road lined with maple trees sprouting their first young leaves, her mother's old house appeared after a curve, the same red-tiled roof, the wooden porch, and the lavender garden blooming in soft purple. She opened the gate. The hinge creaked softly. No sadness lingered this time, only a peace too deep to name. In the kitchen, the old ceramic teapot her mother once used still sat there, beside a cup of Earl Grey stained by time. Evelyn poured the hot water. The fragrance of tea rose gently, mingling with the scent of lavender drifting through the porch. She wrote the first line in her new notebook. I came back not to escape, but to begin again. That afternoon, she walked to the backyard, where her mother used to plant white roses. The soil was dry, but with just a little water, small green sprouts began to push through. Evelyn smiled faintly. Maybe everything just needs a bit of care again, just like her own heart. That night, while rearranging the wooden cabinet in her mother's room, she found an old sealed envelope with her name on it. Evelyn, open when you're ready. Inside was a letter written in blue ink, her mother's handwriting still steady and clear. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, you've probably lived through the kind of loss I once feared most. I won't teach you how to avoid pain, because I know pain is the only teacher that truly makes us strong. Forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness is how we stop letting others define the meaning of our pain. She paused, tears sliding slowly down her cheeks. The letter continued. One day you will understand. Justice is not revenge. Justice is the moment you no longer need an apology to feel at peace. Evelyn set the letter down, her heart quiet. Outside, the night wind brushed through the window, making the white curtain sway like a hand softly touching a healed scar. Sometimes, what we search for our whole lives isn't found in a verdict, but in the words written with love. The next morning, Evelyn woke early. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, spreading across the wooden floor gentle and warm. She put on her boots and walked into the garden, watering the rose bushes that had just begun to bloom. The scent of damp earth and flowers blended together, comforting and alive. On the porch table, her notebook lay open. She wrote the final line in black ink. Justice is not where we end, it's where we begin again. Evelyn looked up. The pond behind the house mirrored the clear blue sky, and a pair of swallows flew past, leaving faint ripples on the water's surface. She took a deep breath and, for the first time in many years, felt her lungs fill with true freedom. In the distance, church bells rang, each note falling softly over Prescott Valley like a quiet blessing. She looked toward the mountains, where the first light of morning spread gold across the peaks, and smiled. As the sun rose, she knew her story was no longer about revenge, but about living on. Morning light spilled across the wooden floor like a thin silk ribbon. The Prescott house, after so many years, no longer carried the shape of sorrow but of peace. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, blending with the faint lavender left drying on the table. The The wind brushed softly against the window frame. Everything was so still that Evelyn could hear the rhythm of her pen touching paper. On the table, her mother's notebook lay open to the final page. Beside it, a cup of coffee and sunlight gleaming across the words she had just written. Back then, I wrote to prove I still existed. Today, I write to prove that I have truly lived. She set the pen down and took a deep breath. No more tension. No more echoes of humiliation from the courtroom. Only silence. A kind of silence that no longer frightened her. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, eyes resting on the lake outside. The surface was still as glass, reflecting a sky, just awakening. 3 years had brought her full circle from loss to understanding, from hatred to gratitude. I once thought justice was where the story ends, she wrote, but now I understand justice is only where we begin again. Each page felt like a breath from someone who had learned how to live again after the storm. She thought of Daniel not with bitterness, but with quiet compassion. He had once believed power was the measure of worth, and now lived in rooms echoing with the silence of his own making. And she, the woman once pushed to the bottom, had found herself in the most unexpected place in a small garden, beside a cup of warm coffee, and an old notebook that still carried her mother's scent. There are wounds that don't need healing, because they are the ones that taught us who we were meant to become. Evelyn opened a drawer and took out an old envelope. Her mother's final letter, its paper faded, but the handwriting still clear. My daughter, never let anyone teach you to shrink in order to be loved. You were born to shine in your own way. And when you find your strength, remember, don't live only for yourself. She folded the letter gently and placed it inside the notebook. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a soft golden glow across her face. Evelyn smiled the smile of someone who had finally understood the meaning of silence. If you're hearing these words, she said softly, maybe you too have lost something, a person, a belief, or even yourself. I just want you to know, silence is not weakness. It's the sign of a soul that no longer needs to prove anything. She closed the notebook and set it beside her cup of coffee. Outside, the sunlight had fully risen. On the lake's surface, a white rose had bloomed after the night's rain. Evelyn looked into the camera, her gaze calm yet vibrant with life. Maybe we can't change the past, but we can choose how to tell it with courage, with forgiveness, and with the light we've walked through. She paused for a moment, then said gently, justice is only where we begin again, not where it ends. Then she turned to the audience. Have you ever chosen silence as your way to start over? Leave a comment below, I'll read every word. Because sometimes, just one shared story can save a heart that's breaking somewhere out there. Hit like and subscribe so I can share more stories that are beautiful and meaningful. And if you have a story of your own, tell it in the comments, because your voice truly matters.